Hi, I'm Emily Watt, and welcome to the latest Bristol University Press webinar. We're on the future of cities after COVID-19. I'm the Senior Commissioning Editor, and I'm really delighted to introduce our speakers for today. So we have Phil Allmendinger, Jon Reades, Martin Crookston, Janice Morphet, and Robin Hambleton. And the panels have a wide range of expertise, and their new books confront the crucial themes of this webinar head on. And it's been a pleasure to work with these authors, some for one or more of their books over the years at the press, and others I've had the opportunity to get to know more recently. I think we're in for a really engaging discussion today about the crucial challenges facing cities and how they can effectively respond during and beyond the pandemic. So first, we're going to speak to Phil Allmendinger. He's the author of The Forgotten City, which I have here. He's going to talk about the accelerated impact of digital technology and the shift to smart cities due to the pandemic. I mean, this is especially relevant given the big shift to working and shopping at home that we've experienced. Next, Jon Reades and Martin Crookston will explore the continuing importance of human contact in business and ask what we can learn from the pandemic. In their book, Why Face-to-Face Still Matters, they look forward to what an e-only work world would look like. Next, following on will be Janice Morphet, and in her book, The Impact of COVID-19 on Devolution, will raise how the UK government seems to be on a path of greater centralisation and ask what impact this will have on the future of UK cities. And finally, but not least, we have Robin Hambleton, who's the author of Cities and Communities Beyond COVID-19. And he will tell us about how the COVID-19 pandemic can open up new opportunities for progressive change, including what we can learn from cities. So just a bit of housekeeping. The speakers will talk for 7 minutes each, with co-authors Jon and Martin speaking for 10 minutes. After that, I'll be putting your questions to the panel. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And if you have any technical issues, please use the chat and someone will help direct you if necessary. Details of how to order their books today at 50% discount will be available here too, and there'll be a recording of the webinar will be available after the event as well. So without delay, I'm going to hand you over to Phil Allmendinger.
Thank you, Emily. So my book, The Forgotten City, started around 3 years ago, and I think it's been a lesson in timing, that it was moving along quite nicely, and suddenly the pandemic hit and I had to go back and revisit large sections of it. But the second element of timing is that I think it's quite topical, if not ironic, that on the day of the Queen's speech, when the Prime Minister will be announcing a new binary planning system of growth and preservation, a very digital approach to planning, actually we're having this discussion about the impact of digital technology upon cities. And what the book starts with is the notion that the planning of cities is very much driven by and shaped by stories, and what counts as the challenges and how we approach them is shaped by the stories that we buy into, be they sustainable development or the resilient city. And one particularly important such story lately has been the smart city, which presents both a way of understanding how cities work, but also some of the solutions, from traffic congestion to crime. And the argument is that smart and digital technology can help solve those problems and do so cheaply. And it is doing that. It's doing that in a multitude of ways. So what's not to like about it? I think that what lies beneath a lot of the digital stardust is a less attractive picture, and one that threatens, in fact, the future of cities. And as we all lose ourselves in our digital world, we become less engaged with the real worlds. So the argument of the book really is it's important to look up from our smartphones and re-engage with what I term the forgotten city, those elements of cities that the digital world doesn't touch. That was the plan. The pandemic came along, and actually there weren't a lot of differences between the impact of the pandemic and digital and what was going on previously in the smart city narrative. In fact, what actually happened is a lot of the changes were accelerated and intensified. So I found myself being part of a much more immediate discussion around the impact of digital technology as part of the Zoom generation that we've all been involved in the past year or so. So what I'm going to talk about really are the four themes, the core major kind of themes of the city, sorry, of the book. And the first is the more negative impacts of digital technology upon cities and the smart city story. And we're told by the smart city story, of course, that it's about making the world a better place. It's about connecting us. It's about using data to improve services. But one of the main arguments is that we don't distinguish between the corporate smart, the corporate digital approach of IBM and Cisco and others, and the individual smart city, our smartphones, the way we go around providing our data and engaging with the providers and the services and the connections, etc., and how those two elements, the corporate and the individual, are working together, if you like, in ways that we don't quite see the bigger picture of, and there's a need to capture that. And then I focus on a number of individual impacts upon the city, and I'm just going to touch upon three very quickly here today. The first is around housing affordability. Many cities around the world are experiencing the Airbnb effect as residents let out their properties for the short-term visitors, taking them out of the local rental market. And it's got to the stage in a number of cities that 10 European capitals have gone to the European Commission and asked for help to address this. In the centre of Paris, 25% of all properties are now for short-term lets on Airbnb. Globally, there are 80,000 locations and 2 million people stay every night in an Airbnb, or certainly did until the pandemic came along, and there's no reason to think that that's going to change going forward. Investors are now, and developers are now buying properties to develop and redevelop specifically for the Airbnb market. And the impacts of that on local housing affordability are, I think, widely known, but the significance and the future implications of that, I think, are going to become far more impactful upon cities as affordability becomes even more of a problem. And the second impact that I talk about is the gig economy. And over the past 12 months or so, the likes of Uber and Deliveroo and TaskRabbit, etc., online supermarket deliveries have exploded, and they've helped support people during the pandemic. Yet the underlying business model was causing significant concern, and the longer term implications are worrying for cities. And this isn't just about zero contract hours and no sick pay and working long days and the precarious nature of work and the anxiety. It's about the longer term impacts of machine learning and artificial intelligence and big data. And it's estimated by the OECD that around 9% of all urban jobs are at risk, and 25% of urban jobs are going to be impacted in some way. Now, if you combine that with the ongoing impacts of globalization upon the employment market, about 1 in 5 jobs in cities could go. And those impacts won't be evenly spread. They're going to hit certain cities, certain sectors, and certain parts of society more than others. And we know that lower income jobs are twice as likely to be replaced than others. And the third consequence of smart and digital technology on the city that I discuss is around collective decision making. And we spent an awful lot of time over the past 4 years in particular listening about fake news and echo bubbles and how the digital has been shaping the news. But the bit that I focus on in particular is the impact on local news, which has been devastating. And it's the loss of advertising revenue, which has dropped more than 50% in the last decade as the likes of Google and Facebook and others have taken that market. And the impact of that on local news and local news providers has been that about 500 newspapers in the United States and about 200 in the UK have closed, along with about 1/3 of journalists' jobs. And that hasn't impacted upon the national as much as the local. And it's at the local level where that level of news and interaction has really been lost. And if we're losing those connections, why would we care really what happens at the local level? And then I go on to talk about the forgotten city itself and the elements that we should be thinking about in cities that digital isn't touching, around health and addiction and homelessness and skills and education attainment, etc., and how we do that collectively. These are the areas that are not easy to fix. These are the wicked problems that in fact digital doesn't focus upon. It focuses on a certain type of issue and a certain type of solutions. But more significantly, I think, the climate emergency and how we address those through our cities is also critical to the future of the planet, not just to cities as well. And how we think about carbon reduction and global food security through our city, and the loss of the collective way in which we address those is going to have significant changes. So what are we going to do about it? Well, the underlying narrative of big tech and smart city is that government is both part of the problem and that digital is the solution. And government is presented as being slow and unresponsive and out of date and reactive, much in the same way that planning is often presented. And a lot of the solutions that we need within our cities and globally are being offered by the likes of Elon Musk, tackling climate change through electric cars, or Amazon and Google trying to make health services more affordable and effective, and Uber and Lyft providing public transport. But digital for planning is both, I think, a positive and a negative side of things. And this is what I also go on to talk about. And it's not been easy for planning to try and tackle these kind of challenges, because the traditional levers have been in many ways undermined. It's no point having, if you like, retail protection policies in city centres if there's no retail whatsoever. And that's, you know, in many ways, machine learning and big data are redefining the very notions of planning itself. And I must say, we're also part of the problem, because there are many planners who actually love this kind of thing and really think that this is the future. What I talk about are the 4 things that I think we need to focus on, just to come to a conclusion here. One of the main challenges of digital upon planning in cities is around the future and time, because digital challenge is really hollowing out the medium term. At one side, we're being given an immediate one-click approach to what it is we want. And at the other side, we're also being, the future is being deferred, that things will always get better in some way, but it's just around the corner. And it's important for planning to reclaim the future and to argue that the medium term, which is where a lot of plans and strategies exist, have value. Planning also needs to rethink the notion of regulation itself, because I've talked about how the old levers in many ways don't work. And planning regulates physical space, but many of the challenges are coming from virtual space. So what does that mean for planning controls in the future? And there's no doubt in my mind that the processes of planning also need to be far less linear and time consuming if we are to address the kind of things that digital does manage to provide some positive benefits for as well. And then finally, I talk about the notion of space, because there are 2 spaces that are really important to digital. There's the global, and how markets and connectivity at the global level enhance the business model, but there's the individual as well. And I think if planning and cities are to have a future in trying to work with digital, they need to think about those kinds of spaces as well as the physical spaces with which planning has traditionally operated. So it's a critical, but I hope optimistic take upon the future and the impact of digital technology on cities, and trying to rewrite the story and shift the gaze away from those kind of problems and solutions that digital is good at, to the rest of the challenges that cities face and the kind of things that traditionally planning and cities have had to address as well. So that's the forgotten city. And I think now I'm passing on to Jon and Martin for their talk.
Great. Thank you, Phil. So it was really sort of quite amusing for me to hear about kind of the timing of Phil's book, because this is our book is also one that's kind of been deeply impacted by its timing. It started work, we started work on it about 10 years ago, based on some PhD research I'd done under Sir Peter Hall, and it was Peter who introduced Martin and me as having similar interests. And I believe we had just sent off kind of the first draft of the manuscript for this book, finally after a decade, about a month before the pandemic struck, which has obviously radically, tested many of our ideas. But what we actually come back to, I think, a lot, even, after a year, is this idea that it is always tempting, and especially in an age of rapid technological change, to think, this time it's different, or, because of the pandemic, everything's going to change. But our book is essentially drawing on the kind of the long history of cities and the long history of economic geography thinking to say that the best guide to the future is almost always the past. So while the book doesn't really engage with the ways that pandemics have reshaped cities in the past, it's worth always keeping in mind, I think, that this is certainly not the first pandemic that cities like London have faced, and nor is it likely to be the last. And I would argue, or we would argue, that after each one of those, cities have recovered and reinvented themselves. And I think that in a sense is what cities do best. Cities are full of creative people who are always reinventing themselves as scientists or chefs, bankers or taxi drivers. And cities excel at bringing these people together and enabling them to create new products and new services. And the way that cities do this is through infrastructure, which we in our book kind of define in a very expansive way, both the sort of big formal infrastructures of planes, trains, and automobiles, and the informal infrastructures, the social infrastructures of bars, restaurants, clubs, theaters, universities, and so on. And what those infrastructures help us to do is to move stuff. And that is to say boxes, bits, and people, and ultimately ideas around. And so the book kind of seeks to build through those different layers and those different scales and different infrastructures to see how they mesh together. And it's really the last of these, the movement of ideas, which we would argue is the hardest to understand and in principle to move. And what cities do best is to enable the effective, if not always efficient from an economic standpoint, movement of knowledge by enabling face-to-face. The extent to which different sectors depend on that varies, and that's kind of something that we can unpack, for hours. So I won't do it here. But so we end up at a position where we're saying, look, face-to-face is crucial. What the pandemic does is, and it's helped us to do in the book, is to actually think much more carefully than we might have originally about where technology substitutes for that desire to meet face-to-face. And so we think that the pandemic has been amazing at showing how we can kind of keep the show on the road, as we are here, electronically, but that the really messy, uncertain stuff that we value most, developing new ideas, new businesses, new relationships, new clients, et cetera, is the part that was most severely impacted by the pandemic. So I think very much in common with what Phil was saying, we would see the pandemic as accelerating existing trends, bringing them into sharper focus for businesses and individuals, but not creating fundamentally new dynamics. I mean, one of the metaphors that we use a lot in the book is that, COVID is the petrol, but it's not the fire. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Martin.
Thanks, John. Yeah, we were struck by the fact that cities have sort of been successively threatened by the death of distance, and then the impact of digital, and then artificial intelligence was going to mean all change, and the pandemic means things will never be the same again. But the reality is that businesses are poised permanently on this ever-moving boundary between what you can do in situ and face-to-face and what can be remote. And that will carry on being true. And it doesn't mean the death of cities. And so we did interviews exploring that boundary between the face-to-face and the digital, that to a greater or lesser extent, and as both of you have said so far, across different sectors, that boundary is shifting. It wasn't a technical sample, but it was a wide range of people, from bankers and insurance people across to admin and the producer of Love Island and so on. So quite a range. We interviewed the whole set of them about why central London, why face-to-face, and looked in detail at what people did over the previous week, face-to-face or not, and why. We then re-interviewed a third of them during the pandemic, and we asked them about the immediate impacts, what they missed about face-to-face, why it mattered if it did, and what their view of the future was. Is it a flash in the pan, or is this the new normal? And we learnt a lot about the reasons for the continuing vital role of face-to-face, and it's strongly aligned, the interview output strongly aligned with our analytical chapters, which, as Jon has said, were this layering from infrastructure up through how markets work, how transactions work, how people operate. And then, as I say, we then dived into interviews to explore how people operate in central London in the first part of the 21st century. And it's clear that face-to-face and working from home and their implications for businesses and for cities, they're not just about personal preference. A lot of the discussion recently is whether your staff want to work from home or not, or whether you as a firm are going to make them, and all that kind of thing. And that's not actually where it's at, in our view. This is not just about personal preference. It's whether or not you as a firm can actually risk not being here in the key sectors. And that goes to the core of why it is that firms don't leave central places, why they keep on paying absolutely crazy rents in EC3 rather than moving to somewhere more civilized like Watford. And that's really what a lot of what our book's about, is trying to explore this frontier all the time. In the end, if you think about what this means for cities and towns, which we do in the last couple of chapters, it leads us to perhaps a rather almost downbeat view of the likely post-pandemic changes for each level of the urban hierarchy. I mean, for the great cities, for central London and Manhattan and Parisville, we see continuing growth, actually. It'll slow down, perhaps, flatten the growth curve. There'll be a changing mix of activities, but it's onwards and fairly well upwards. For the country towns, and we look in some detail at Shrewsbury and also a quick sideways glance at Bourges in central France and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, as a sort of typical medium-sized rural town in the States. The message is really be careful. There aren't millions and millions of jobs waiting to land on you, as has been hinted by a lot of the literature. If people can move to Shropshire, they can probably move to Shenzhen. And so we look at them, and we look at many other sorts of place, and we look at the implications for how business is done and for property sectors and types. But I'm not going to do that now, and my time's up, so I'm going to hand over to Janice.
Right, thanks, Martin. So this is a bit of a switch of gear now for Robin and I. We're going to be talking about governance and sort of coming up a few scales, perhaps thinking about what's the context for all this change that both Phil and then Jon and Martin have actually spoken about. So my book actually looks at how the UK is, the effects in a way of it being the most centralised state in the OECD, and that's a view the OECD have expressed in 2000 and in 2020, so nothing has changed. And yet the research of the OECD shows that if you want to improve the domestic economy, really you need to have a much more devolved system of governance. So we can think about, say, metro mayors or devolution in Scotland and Wales. And the issue for us in the UK, which again is quite different, I think, is that the UK has no written constitution. And so that means that any level of governance below the state is actually only a creature of statute. It is only a creature of what Parliament, the powers Parliament gives it, and what Parliament gives, it can also take away. And we had some security when we were in the EU, because the EU treaties bound the UK government to implement subsidiarity in 3 successive waves. But with now after Brexit, really that kind of support has gone, that legal support has gone. And what we've been beginning to see from 2014 onwards is that Whitehall particularly has been trying to chip away at these devolved powers, particularly first in Wales, and then we've seen it accelerate during the legislation that's been brought into effect post-Brexit, thinking about how we are going to look at funding and decisions on funding at the local level have all been removed. Some devolved powers have been removed. So this is particularly what the book addresses, and it looks at this at national level, at the level of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and it looks at sort of local, regional level as well. And I think what we can see is the Prime Minister seems to be very keen on re-centralising the state. He's not very interested in localism, despite the fact that when he centralised the response to the pandemic through PPE and everything else, his poll ratings zoomed down. As soon as he localised vaccination, they zoomed up. So there's a big lesson there to learn. But then on the other hand, if we think about what's happened over the weekend, where devolution has occurred, say through the city mayors in England, then those mayors that stood up to the Prime Minister and declared their localism or their support for their local area, if you like, reinforce that, have actually done much better in these elections. And that, of course, doesn't encourage the Prime Minister towards any further devolution. And we've seen only in the last few days that so there'll be no devolution white paper, and it's all going to focus on levelling up. And we've also seen early this year, 2019, that individual projects across the whole of the UK are going to be, at local level, are going to be approved actually by the Treasury, including some quite small ones. So really we've got this enormous centralisation going on. And the kind of voter allegiance is obviously being reinforced through what the BBC describe as pork barrel politics. And, you know, we've got the big summit coming up between Scotland and Wales and the Prime Minister and Northern Ireland. And, you know, that might lead to further powers being kind of reined back. So we see this kind of big pressure towards re-centralising the state, as if, you know, going back to 1999 and 2000 was a bit of an experiment. And Whitehall kind of thinks now, well, we've had enough of that. We want to go back to where we were before. But then, of course, you know, cities and local authorities are fighting back. They're trying to be more independent, and the book discusses some of this. In England, the revenue support grant that tapered off from 2011 to 2017-18 has actually made councils look to income generation. They've looked to be self-supporting as far as they're able to be. And of course, when the Prime Minister's approached the pandemic sort of really cut them out altogether, they realised that the Whitehall only thought about them as a sector rather than as a partner. All previous emergency planning issues, whether it's foot and mouth or flooding, it's always been a joint effort between central government and local government, but not so for the pandemic, at least for the first 9 months or so. Councils have been looking at commercialisation, buying property, trying to generate income. They've been bringing services back in-house. And we've got this great increase in municipal enterprise in terms of councils providing housing again, and they're grasping the Green agenda. So what we're seeing is sort of two counter things going on. So we've got the government trying to increase centralisation, and then we've got those devolved administrations, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the cities, trying to increase their ability to stand on their own 2 feet and make their decisions, and do that through, as far as possible, their own funding. Of course, you can't do that at the scale of Manchester or Birmingham. You do need national funding to do that. But as we see today in the Queen's speech, no devolution white paper, no further powers for devolution. Levelling up is really, seems to be a message for closing up and closing down local decision making. And what we might see as a result of all of this, and this is not what I want to see, but actually we might see the removal of some of the powers of local authorities, of city mayors and of the Scottish Welsh Parliaments and Northern Ireland Assembly as these things get more centralised. And in a way, the book, just to finish, is just trying to see how far both Brexit and the pandemic were kind of being used together as a mechanism to prosecute this kind of policy from the Prime Minister. And the book really just tries to look at some futures and see where we might be going after this. But as we know, after the weekend, it's all to play for. So I'll hand over to Robin, who can tell us a story in Bristol, I think.
Well, thanks very much, Janice. And thank you to you and to Jon and Martin and Phil. I've never been in a book webinar like this. It's really good to share ideas. Can I just encourage people to put questions into the Q&A box? I think this will help Emily at the end when we want to try and respond to what you're thinking. So I'm going to keep it very brief. I'm just going to make 3 points about my new book. It's called Cities and Communities Beyond COVID-19, How Local Leadership Can Change Our Future for the Better. The 3 points are about the complexity of the challenges. Secondly, the importance of understanding the power of place. And thirdly, I will just say briefly a few words about the Bristol One City approach, which really is trying to deliver some new forms of collaboration in this city. So first off, the complexity. In the book, I suggest that city leaders face 4 major challenges at once. There's probably more, but 4 is perhaps enough. The COVID health emergency, a kind of downturn in the economy because of the pandemic. Thirdly, the climate crisis, and I include there the ecological crisis. And fourthly, a dramatic increase in inequality in our societies. So these are serious challenges. And I think the key point I'd like to make is you need to tackle them together. This really reinforces what Janice has just been saying. You've got to have an integrated approach at the local level, not some sort of silo arrangement from Whitehall. On the pandemic, and it is distressing. I'm suggesting in my book, there's a double impact on us as people living our lives. The first impact is appalling suffering. And I just checked the figures again this morning. 159 million people have been infected and 3.3 million people have died. On top of that, we've had this extraordinary inequality in the way the disease manages to hurt the most vulnerable. So it's a really bad news side of the equation here. However, and this is where my book picks up, there is something really quite positive happening in the way people have responded to this. We've seen an incredible upsurge in community-based problem solving, which is really quite inspiring. So I think this is really what we need to try and focus on. What can we do to shift towards a new way of thinking in society, which cares for people and cares for the environment. So I have quite a bit of a discussion about caring as being the key guide to how we do recover from COVID-19. And you're probably going to have to do that locally. We do care across space, yes, but most of the action to solve these issues is going to be local. That's the complexity. Second point quickly is about place-based power and placeless power. There's some concepts in the book here about the nature of power in modern society. And in a nutshell, I'm suggesting we've seen a startling expansion of placeless power in the last 30 years. And by that, I mean decision makers who make decisions about places without caring about the impact of those decisions on places. So you only have to think for a moment or two about the growth of multinational companies that invest or disinvest to suit their interests and their shareholders. I was really interested in what Phil said. I think he brought it out rather well. I hadn't thought about it in this way, but the collapse of local media is a good illustration, I think, Phil, of that move of power away from place to these multinational organizations. So what do we do about that? We change it and reverse it. We expand place-based power. And to do that, we need new approaches to local leadership. And in the book, I develop a model of new civic leadership, which involves 5 realms co-creating new possibilities in a place. These are political leaders, public and managerial leaders, trade unions, business leaders, and community leaders. I'm skipping through this quickly, but there's a rich group of activists in every city in those different realms. And the key thing is, if you bring them together, you can create remarkable innovation. So this is what I think we're seeing happening in a lot of places around the world. In my book, it's international. I look at some remarkable examples. Places like Copenhagen and Freiburg come to mind. But within the UK, we've got some remarkable achievements also. I'm thinking at the moment of Wigan and Preston. And in a minute, I'll say a little bit about Bristol. In fact, why don't I go to that and then we can get the discussion opening up. My third last point then is about the Bristol One City approach. And I must admit, this is something that is just an accident, but I think we've developed this collaborative leadership in Bristol this last 5 years under the leadership of Marvin Rees, who was elected as our directly elected mayor. This would be in 2016, but it's not just Marvin Rees. There's been a real expansion of civic leadership activity from these 5 realms of leadership through an approach that we call the One City approach. There is quite a good website now that's available, so I don't need to dwell on it. It's called bristol1city.com. I think the key point I'd make about that is we've created a plethora of new initiatives to solve problems in the city that would not have happened if you didn't have this collaboration in place. A key overarching achievement is a One City plan for the city, which is not a city council plan, it's a collective plan to 2050, and it's rolled forward annually with a lot of active citizen participation. And the youth mayors have the right to choose one of the priorities each year. So I think it's quite a nice inclusive model. It's not perfect, the people involved would be the first to say that. So I think I'm going to stop because I think it's better to hand this over to some interaction from our participants. So over to you, Emily. Thank you very much.
Oh, microphone.
Yes, still a rookie. Thank you very much, everyone, for keeping to time, and it's really interesting to hear your views pulling the themes of the webinar together, and also hearing a bit about your books and your insights of what the future holds for cities. We have got some questions that are coming through. So we have 6 altogether. So I was just scanning through. We've got 2 by the same person. So I'll start off at the top. So the first one's for inspired by Phil's talk. And I don't know if you can see the Q&As, Phil. So I won't detail all, everything that's been said. But the essential question is looking at tastes of traditionalists in terms of, I'll read it out. Create cities see digital visualization as a route to democratizing planning choices in cities. And since these tastes are traditionalists, they believe that in general people are traditional building forms, and they hope that this will lead to people choosing to build the kind of cities they like. So they want to ask, do you see a route to democratized planning via digitalization, or are there larger chunks of the planning process to which that is irrelevant?
A deceptively simple sounding question with a very complex background.
Yes.
I think there are 3 points that I want to make in response to that. So one of the things I talk about in the book, one of the examples, comes from Santa Monica. And what they've done there is they've, I think, really taken digital to an extreme. And they were preparing one of their plans for the downtown area. And their public consultation was you log on and you can do this still, it's still there. And they'll show you 2 photographs side by side. Do you want this or do you want this? And you literally swipe left. And it is Tinder for planning, and that's what they've characterized it as. And that's what they see consultation as being under a digital approach. Now, at the other end of the extreme, I think there are lots of positive examples. I mean, many cities, particularly new cities now, are born with a digital twin, and the building information management, the city information management provide the opportunity for people to engage much more with ideas and design, and that's always going to be a good thing. I think where the danger with that lies in where we put on digital goggles and the means becomes the end, if you like, and the planning is done within that arena rather than using that as a way to enable greater engagement. But the final bit, and this is the complicated bit I think about this always comes down to what do you mean by democracy? Because I'm afraid a lot of people in planning see democracy as being about a veto or having a say that's it will be determinate when it comes to a decision. And until we move away from a lot of the slippery concepts like sustainable development and be much clearer about what we mean by what planning is there to help deliver and how people are going to engage with it and what their say is going to help with, then I think we will always have this question about the role of democracy in planning and what's and how digital can help achieve that or not is going to be dependent upon being much clearer about what the role of the public is in the different parts of the planning process. So that's what I would say in relation very quickly to that question.
Thank you very much. I'll throw one out to the panel. One came in about what a post-COVID landscape will look like in terms of opportunities for renewed polycentricity in the larger cities such as London. So does anyone want to?
Jon?
Yeah, I'll make a stab at starting, and then Martin can correct me or shut me up if I'm rambling. So I would see this question about, is there kind of polycentricity in London as being related to the subsequent one about reports of businesses looking to relocate out of London to coastal locations, setting up satellite. So I think those two things are intertwined. And
that's the other question about
relocation.
Thank you for picking that up.
And I think that, you know, what Martin and I believe would argue is that the answers, if you will, are sectorally specific. So there are, for instance, in the technology industry, which is what I used to work in, depending on which bit of the tech industry you're in, information flows tend to be internal and team-based, they're long-standing, they're stable. This is something that you could potentially quite easily pick up and move somewhere else. I mean, in fact, you know, Oracle, Microsoft, you know, Telefonica, all of those companies in the kind of old, you know, Cambridge, Oxford arc, you know, those technology companies are already out there. It's actually a relatively new trend that companies like Google and Facebook are moving into cities, but that's because actually they're in a different business. So where you have complexity, where you have uncertainty, where you have lots of flows across boundaries, you know, whether it's theater or, you know, high-end finance, those I think are going to be much harder to move out to kind of less central locations, which are by definition less accessible to kind of the myriad of ways that people move around. And so I think that's a big part of it. I also would say that what at least so far seems to be that pattern of people moving out is that they're still staying somewhere that they can get back to London fairly easily. Your commute is longer because you're not expecting to do it as frequently, but you know, it's a lot harder to pick up from London and say, right, we're going to move to Snowdonia and run our business out of there than to look at, you know, Brighton, Hove, you know, places that are still actually quite accessible to London. So so I think, yes, we could see more polycentricity quite probably, but it will be a polycentricity that's informed by that continuing center, which is why, you know, I would say that the future for London, even if it looks different, is not kind of a return to the kind of post-World War II decline.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, we did have a debate, in fact, thinking specifically about how polycentric might London become? Would its suburban centres start to become more important, stronger, and so on? And there's a bit of a debate between Jon and me about that very choice. You know, because you can do a lot of stuff in let's say Walthamstow, where you can live, operate in coffee shops, commute not every day perhaps to your job in the city centre, and it's all pretty convenient. Some of those places can probably thicken up in business terms and residential terms as well. But the limit to that is the perceived need of people to be pretty well on call. And that's why the central activities zone is what it is, because so many of those businesses just do not feel confident about not being within the drop of a hat type, need to get all around a table distance. That is, so I came out of our interviews over and over again how critical that was still for so many businesses. But as Jon says, there are many, many sectors where the digital offer now is so strong that they do not need to pay those costs and they will choose to relocate. But that has been going on for 50 years.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to thank you for your insights there. That's really helpful. I'm just going to move on. There's a question for Janice and Robin that's just come through at the bottom. Just thank you for your presentations. You both suggest greater devolution and decentralisation to cities and local government, and they say that it's necessary. And given all central government, at least as far back as 1979, when I was born, have been instinctive centralisers, is devolution in the UK a realistic prospect? So over to one of you, to whoever wants to go first.
Well, perhaps I'll start first. I think it's a kind of a bit of a local authorities. I talked about the pandemic being a mechanism where the Prime Minister's been able to centralise, but you also think about local authorities conducting a bit of a guerrilla war as well, trying to establish their difference. If the Prime Minister doesn't want to work with them over COVID, then they're going to find their own way of doing it, which they've done and illustrated that they can do it. But they've also, at the same time, been very quietly increasing their levels of borrowing and investment in order to generate income. And although I know the government wants to remove those powers and remove councils, particularly from investing in commercial properties, the fact is, if they did that, the extent, it's a long-standing practice of councils forever, 100 years of doing that. They run the risk of undermining the property sector if they do that on a big scale. So they can't really do that. So I just think that it's a kind of, maybe it's a tortoise and a hare. And will local authorities be able to survive before the Prime Minister's reign comes to an end? I think what we've seen is, as we saw going back to the 1980s and 90s, early 90s, when Thatcher, had really dismantled local government, then local authorities really got on board with Rio Local 2021, if you remember. And in a way, I think that's why local authorities are really climbing onto the climate crisis now. They see that as something which is local, just as they did in the early 90s. So I think it's we have to wait and see as to where this is going.
Thank you.
Other comment as well then. Thanks for it, David. Is devolution a realistic prospect? Well, yes, it is, because they're already falling behind other countries that are far more successful because they do have devolved leadership and management. So it's going to be an increasing pressure to make this change. And I think the nature of the problems we now face, and I was trying to push this argument, are complex and need to be handled in an integrated way. We can't actually do it. Perhaps I could add a quick comment in, Emily, if it's okay, but one or two questions about the Bristol One City.
Yes, I saw those. I was going to come to those next, but if you want to answer those quickly now, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you for those different questions and comments. That's really helpful. Clearly, it's an ambitious way of working, but I'd like to say one thing first. The European Union has a competition for the most innovative cities on the continent, And in 2019, Bristol was recognised as one of the 6 most innovative in Europe because of the one city approach. We've got independent, rigorous evaluation demonstrating how effective it is. It's not a centralising model at all. It disperses power to a wide range of people. At the last city gathering in March, we had over 400 civic leaders in the same engaged process. And that's a small fraction of the numbers of leaders who are now taking action across the city. So I think it's a mistake to say it's centralised. It's the opposite. And then the last thing, I think it was Nicky Britton was saying, how do you get this collaboration to happen? It's not easy. There's lots of ways of doing it. And I think in the future, the Bristol approach needs to become even more inclusive. And we're back to developing very inclusive ways of working. But this is happening now in many countries. And it is place-based. So that's why we need the devolution that Janice referred to. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. I think we've got time for maybe one, maybe 2 quick questions, but one I spotted was from an anonymous attendee. I said, I attended a Westminster forum yesterday on the importance of universities in places. So what do the panel see universities as having? Do you see universities as having a significant role in the future of cities globally? What might the problem be in universities taking a place leadership role? So I'll throw that out if anyone wants to.
This is chapter 7.
Is that your quick answer?
Don't tell them, they've got to buy the book.
But very quickly, I think that one of our arguments is that universities are an interesting sector in that they tend to be counter-cyclical. So we all thought universities were in for a hiding last year, and of course, because people would wait to have the face-to-face experience, and instead, of course, everyone's like, well, I'm stuck at home, I might as well go back to university. So I think there's a strong counter-cyclical element there, but that doesn't anymore have to be place-based, as we demonstrated. What I think universities in normal times do is they provide, in a sense, a scale of amenity that is not normally sustained by a town of the same size. You've got lots of art students, theater students, music students doing all sorts of things that make a place seem like a bigger, and where you get multiple scales colliding as they do in Cambridge, which is, obviously globally competitive in the higher education market, but also life sciences, everything else. When all of those come together, you get a very kind of vibrant city with high growth, I would say. The challenge is always the dreams of the deans to be internationally relevant, as opposed to anchoring in what's feasible locally and how they build wider partnerships, which I don't expect to be solely pragmatic. It's not just about employment, but it is about kind of recognizing the limits of what a university can achieve.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to chip in?
I could chip in a quick comment on that one. I think the significant things are happening that are good news in universities in the UK. Many scholars are very interested in being active in the places where they live and work. And that's a great resource and a great asset. I call universities the sleeping giants of place-based leadership. But the good news is the giant's waking up. So we've got the University Commission report, and we've got a lot more energy coming into the local conversations from universities in the UK. Last quick point, other countries are quite a long way ahead. My last job was in Chicago, and there, the universities in the States as a whole, particularly the public ones, actually expect scholars to be engaged in their cities, making contributions and collaborating as part of what they expect. And I can see that happening more now in the UK. And I think there's a shift in the leadership of some of our universities that are picking this up. There's many examples now, but I'd mention Newcastle that have done some really bold work. Universities are a resource that can help cities, but also can help inform and improve our research as scholars. So it's a two-way process that's mutually beneficial.
Thank you. I'm just aware of the time, unless anyone else wants to answer that question. I've got one final question, and then I'll do my, I'll wrap it up at the end. So So there's a question for everyone. There are widespread expectations that cities are engines of policy and social innovation. Are these expectations warranted, and can these innovations be scaled up and or successfully transferred?
I think if I could just start, the innovation means lots of things, and cities are very good at some of the bits of innovation that are connected to these highly face-to-face linked businesses and so on. But it's striking that innovation also takes place in quite unexciting places like science parks, which are not much more than business parks with pointy heads in them. And so it's important, I think, to separate out what we mean by innovation. The social innovation, which I think is the thrust of this question, yes, I think the cities are the retorts, the test tubes in which all that happens, very much. But I think that it doesn't follow in a straight line, that the city is always the place where technical innovation is necessarily located.
Thank you, Martin.
Any other thoughts? No?
Well, I guess I'll dive in is just to say, I think, you know, we, again, obviously we focused on technical innovation, but I suspect some of this transfers to social innovation, which is the importance of context, right? So one size fits all prescriptions, we would say, are never going to work in in any country, let alone Britain, where you have these kind of divergence of scales. But, kind of understanding, paying attention to the context enables you to understand which bits of which lessons have wider relevance or are relevant to you in your town, city, and the challenges that you face.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to say anything in response to that last question? I'm just aware of the time. So thank you everyone who asked questions. I'm really sorry we haven't managed to get through all of them. There's really some really different and engaging questions, and the whole panel could answer some of them individually and together, so that's brilliant. I'm just going to do just say my final words, and then we can sort of finish up. But it feels like we could chat for a lot longer. So I just want to say thank you to Phil and Martin and Jon and Janice and Robin for joining us at the Bristol University Press webinar. Thank you for your time. And as we put on the chat, please take the opportunity to have a look at the books and take the 50% discount opportunity. So you'll see, we've been putting it on the chat, but we'll do that after the event, at the end of the event as well. So I found the talks and question session really engaging. So if this discussion has inspired you and you'd like to discuss any further book ideas, obviously please do contact me, and my email details will follow in the chat. And finally, we have our next webinar will be about health inequalities and the pandemic on the 23rd of June. So that's featuring Claire Bamborough, Kat Smith, Terry Givens and Adrian Bonner. So just keep an eye out on our social media for more information. And finally, thank you very much to the panel for all your time. I hope you found it useful and as engaging as me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.